and Fisheries, hosted by Japan 2 years ago, and one given by Serge to the FAO Committee on Fisheries Investigations just this year. Those are quite different audiences, but we found both of them interested in the messages that we've conveyed. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that this comes from two gray-haired people with 30 to 40 years in the trenches, trying to deal with these issues in the real world.
Just hit the key.
Okay.
Next key.
There isn't any next key. Okay, here we are. When you're managing fisheries, there are some obvious constraints that you have to deal with, and hopefully there are some explicit objectives you're trying to achieve. In responsible fisheries, the objectives always are some variant of either trying to maintain or increase the contribution of fish to the livelihoods, which is not necessarily the same as corporate profit, and to global food security. And the constraint, of course, is that you're trying to do this while limiting all the impacts of the exploitation on the ecosystem. Not just impacts of the fishery on the target species, which 25 to 30 years ago was the sole objective of either national government fisheries regulatory bodies or regional fisheries management organizations. But all of them now, and this has been reviewed by CBD and UNEP as well as FAO, and they all conclude the types of ecosystem goals you would expect are found in the policies and often the corporate documents of the RMFOs and national bodies. Fishing is using biodiversity, and there ought to be some biodiversity objectives as well. And you can find them phrased in different ways depending on what organization you're looking at. But they always are variants of some of these same concepts. You're trying to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem, whether you're measuring it in terms of the stuff that's in it, the biomass, its diversity, structure and function, or ecological processes, things like that. That's what it takes to use ecosystems sustainably. Maintain and protect all those things. And the obvious constraint, again, you want to limit the impacts on the human populations. You need to respect all those constraints. But there are dependent livelihoods, dependent economies, and more human nutrition dependent on what we're taking out of those ecosystems. There's an obvious tension here because the objective for fisheries management is the constraint for biodiversity, and the objective for biodiversity conservation is the constraint for fisheries management. How do we resolve that tension? We've got frameworks in which to try to do it. The Aichi biodiversity targets give one such framework that ought to be familiar to most of us. And there's a number of Aichi biodiversity targets which are quite relevant to this issue of how are we going to use the ocean to meet human food security needs, human livelihoods, and conserve those properties of the ecosystem, its biomass, its structure, and its function at the same time. I won't walk through these by number, Most of you probably know them by heart anyway. You're all loyal conservationists. This should be part of your daily catechism. The important message is, if you look at the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fishing, started in the 1990s and augmented even up to the present with more and more depth of content. Everything in these Aichi biodiversity targets you can find in the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fishing. There's a comforting message here. There's no intrinsic conflict on the principles in which these two different approaches are taken. The principles, the overarching objectives of biodiversity conservation as captured in the Aichi targets, and the overarching principles of responsible fishing captured in the FAO guidance. The devil is in the detail. The challenge is in how that tension plays out in the real world, comes in the implementation choices that have to be made. There's a bunch of measures that can, and in an increasingly large number of jurisdictions, are being applied for the conservation of biodiversity by fisheries management organizations. Whoops. In fishing, there has been a tremendous effort for at least 20 years to try to bring about reduction of fishing capacity. We don't need debates that it's excessive. It is. There's no disagreement with that. The issue is, how do you resolve reductions of global fishing capacity? And there's a bunch of measures that are in there. And you can also deal with biodiversity considerations through a bunch of trade measures. And particularly in the 2000s, there's been a real growth in attention to putting trade measures in place in that affect particularly large-scale commercial fisheries. And among the purposes of the measures are exactly the types of biodiversity conservation outcomes that one hopes are entrenched in good fisheries management. And again, you can read for yourself the nature of what many of those measures are. And at the end of the day, fishing is carried out for human consumption. Whether it's direct consumption or some fish are recycled through other fish, pigs or something, to get to human consumption. But at the end of the day, that's why you fish. And there's increasing efforts to educate the consuming public about the ecosystem effects of different types of fishing, and whether it's some form of eco-certification or other instruments, using the consumer as the ultimate lever to ensure that fisheries are taking biodiversity conservation seriously. Now, the challenges that fisheries face making those different kinds of biodiversity-friendly instruments work and bring about the outcomes we all want are not simple challenges. Right now, fisheries take, capture fisheries take in the neighborhood of 90 million metric tons. One can debate the accuracy, the statistics on which that's based, increase it or decrease it by about 10%. But that's unquestionably the neighborhood of global fishing catches, and it is down from a peak half a decade or so ago when global fish captures exceeded 100 million metric tons, and there's almost no debate that the way fishing was prosecuted at that time, those were unsustainable levels. That's the size of the catch that's available for human consumption. 42 million jobs on this planet our livelihoods are traced directly to fishing, and 500 million livelihoods are affected by fishing by the time you take all the support livelihoods that help the people who are involved in catching the fish in one way or another. Of the 7 billion people on the planet, fish comprise at least 20% of the protein intake for 2 of those 7 billion people. On average, it's lower, but the 20% is a low estimate for most of the parts of the world where food security is most at risk. The parts of the world where hunger is most widespread, where malnutrition and protein deficit is most serious, are the parts of the world where fish comprise the largest part of the non-plant protein consumption. Those are all nice statistics. It shows how important fishing is for the planet. But a number of different reviews, including by FAO, conclude there's at least 3/4 of the fisheries on the planet that are underperforming compared to how well they could perform. And what's called the sunken billions estimates fisheries are not producing $50 billion worth of revenue and well-being that they could be producing were they as well managed as could be achieved with existing tools. The targets we have to meet with these challenges are also moving ones. The human population by 2050 is going to grow by another 2 billion people, and almost all that growth is going to be in the parts of the world where fish are the dominant non-plant protein source and will continue to be so. Not only is the population increasing, it's becoming increasingly urbanized and increasingly coastal. 6 of those 9 billion people will live in coastal areas or megacities on coasts or estuaries. And when you do some simple arithmetic using standard World Health Organization estimates of how much protein a typical adult human being needs for a healthy lifestyle, and this is not an extravagant, these are the minimum requirements. This leads to an increase of 350 million metric tons of protein required to keep the nutrition on this planet at the state it is now in 2050. What does that mean for fisheries? A minimum of 75 million metric tons more protein from the sea by 2050. And if a lot of the climate change projections that we will see decreases in crop production in many parts of the world hold true, decreases due to increased temperature, decreased rainfall, then the 75 million becomes a conservative estimate. And if we are going to maintain human nutrition at the state it is now, we need much more than 75 million metric tons of protein from the sea 40 years from now. Where is it going to come from? We live in a planet where there's increasing poverty, increasing global indebtedness. Everyone in this room is aware of the debt crisis, the increasing discrepancy of distributional wealth on the planet, increasing pollution, contamination, coastal degradation, use of water for many urban requirements and agriculture, climate change, all these things are running counter to our need for 75 million more metric tons of fish. If we look at the human population, this is what's projected. If we look at the fish protein production, this is what we can project. So, we've got an obvious challenge that we face in the very near future. The fishing we're doing can't keep increasing. We know from what we learned when fish catches were above 100 million metric tons. The way we were fishing then was unsustainable. 90 million metric tons, we're not sure yet whether it's sustainable or not. We're hoping it is. So what are we going to do? Is it possible to get that 75 million metric tons or more protein from aquatic sources on this planet, and what would be the cost to the environment of trying to do so? These are the hard realities that those of us who are working in the system deal with and are trying to get dialogue going on. We need to add 50% to the protein harvested from the sea and freshwater sources. That's an unchallengeable reality unless somebody can come up with completely new sources of protein for humans. If we expand catching of high trophic levels, we know we will have problems with overfishing. We've learned that the hard way. We know that the catches in the deep ocean are not going to be large, and they come at high environmental risks and high risks to sustainability. We've learned that the hard way. We've learned that stock rebuilding is slow. It takes a long time, and there are high transition costs that someone has to pay in livelihoods and economies. And even if we get stocks rebuilt to historical levels, fishing them at historical rates will undo the effort of rebuilding. You can't just build them up and then repeat the overfishing that we've done in the past. We could get greater yield by distributing fishing effort more broadly through the ecosystem. You could take more from lower trophic levels, but we all know the risks associated with fishing lower trophic levels that are also food for any number of other organisms in the sea. And with every agency on the planet responsible for fishing committed to some variant of the ecosystem approach to fishing, we know that we have to keep an eye on the diversity of these ecosystems, maintaining their structure and function. And how you distribute fishing while trying to achieve all those outcomes is not a straightforward challenge. Science has partial answers to all of it, complete answers to almost none of it. We certainly know how much past fishing has changed our aquatic ecosystems, and rarely, from a biodiversity perspective, change them for the better. Now, if we want to protect ecosystem processes, we have some very pro-biodiversity measures that we can implement. If you want to protect ecosystem processes from stress, reduce stresses on them, reduce fishing. If you want to increase ecosystem resilience to climate change, we know what we have to do. Reduce other stresses on those ecosystems, and fishing is usually one of the biggest ones. If we want to protect the parts of marine ecosystems or freshwater ecosystems that are most sensitive to perturbation, we know what to do. Fish them less. If we want to improve coastal habitats, Certainly, reducing land-based pollution is a crucial component, but reducing fishing pressure on those communities has to be part of a conservation package for coastal habitat protection. And if we care about the integrity of natural biodiversity communities, reduce the exposure of those systems to alien invasive species, of which aquaculture is one of many pathways to bring new species into ecosystems. And for all of these objectives, increase the areas that are protected from perturbation by MPAs, whether they're no-take MPAs or more carefully managed MPAs. It should be obvious, all the measures that you can take to protect the integrity, structure, and function of our aquatic ecosystems call for reducing fisheries. And if we do, we'll improve the state of biodiversity. What share of the cost of improving biodiversity falls to the fisheries community compared to